I know why you went cold. Not because you didn't care, but because caring became heavy. Life didn't ask if you were ready, it just kept taking. You smiled, you stayed quiet, you told the world you were fine. But inside, something was slowly learning how to survive alone. I'm not here to judge you. I'm not here to rush you. I'm here because even when you pulled away, your heart was still speaking. This isn't about blame. This is about understanding. And if you think no one noticed your silence, you're wrong. I'm still here. And this message is for the part of you that never gave up. You didn't wake up one day and decide to become cold. It wasn't a choice made in comfort or arrogance. It was something quieter than that, something slower. It happened in moments no one applauded, in nights when your thoughts were louder than the world, in days when giving less felt like the only way to keep anything at all. You learned that warmth costs energy, and energy was something life kept demanding without giving back. So you adjusted, you spoke less, you trusted slower, you felt deeper but showed less. People called it distance, but for you it was protection. There's a kind of tiredness that sleep doesn't fix, a kind that settles into your bones and teaches you restraint. You carried expectations that weren't yours, responsibilities you never asked for, disappointments you didn't earn. Every time you opened up, something seemed to go wrong. Every time you explained yourself, it felt misunderstood. So eventually, you stopped explaining. Not because you had nothing to say, but because saying it never changed anything. Silence became simpler. Silence became safer. You weren't trying to punish anyone. You weren't trying to prove a point. You were trying to breathe. When you've been strong for too long, strength starts to feel like a cage. People admire it, lean on it, depend on it, but rarely ask what it costs. They see that you're steady and assume you don't feel the weight. They mistake your calm for immunity. They don't notice the cracks because you learned how to stand with them. You gave what you could until what you had left wasn't enough. You showed up until showing up meant leaving yourself behind. And somewhere along the way, you realized that disappearing a little felt better than breaking completely. So you pulled back. You became careful with your words, selective with your energy, distant with your heart. From the outside, it looked like you didn't care anymore. From the inside, it was the only way to keep caring at all. You learned that not everyone deserves access to your inner world. Not everyone who asks is prepared to understand what they find. Some people want warmth but don't know how to handle truth. Some want your light but not your shadows. You saw that giving everything doesn't guarantee being valued, and loyalty doesn't always come back the way it's given. That lesson doesn't make you bitter, it makes you aware. So when you went cold, it wasn't because you stopped feeling, it was because you felt too much for too long without shelter. You absorbed emotions that weren't yours to carry. You listened when no one listened back. You stayed when leaving would have been easier, until staying became heavier than walking away. That kind of experience doesn't harden you overnight. It teaches you patience, caution, and distance one layer at a time. There's a quiet dignity in the way you endure. You don't announce your pain. You don't demand sympathy. You don't need to be seen as strong. You just refuse to fall apart in public. And when people ask why you changed, you don't know how to answer without reopening wounds you worked hard to close. Explaining yourself feels like standing naked in the cold, so you keep your coat on and let them guess. You still care. That's the part they don't see. You still notice details, still remember words, still feel the weight of moments long after they pass. You just don't chase anymore. You don't force connection where effort is one-sided. You don't pour into empty spaces hoping something will grow. You've learned that peace isn't found in being understood by everyone, but in understanding yourself enough to stop overextending. Going cold doesn't mean you gave up on love, hope, or people. It means you stopped betraying yourself to keep them comfortable. It means you chose balance over approval, truth over performance. You realized that constantly proving your worth was exhausting, especially to those who never questioned it. So you stepped back, not in anger, but in self-respect. There are things you wish you could say, moments you wish you could relive with less innocence and more boundaries. You've replayed conversations in your head, wondering if being softer would have changed anything, or if being firmer would have saved you time. But growth isn't about rewriting the past, it's about learning from it, without letting it define you. You don't shut people out completely, you just let them meet you where you are instead of where they want you to be. You're not colder, you're clearer. Clearer about what drains you, clearer about what matters, clearer about the fact that your energy is finite and your heart is not a resource to be mined. When you give now, it's intentional. When you stay, it's because you choose to, not because you feel obligated. And even now, after everything, there's a part of you that remains open, quietly, carefully open. You still believe in connection that feels safe, in conversations that don't require armor, in presence that doesn't demand performance. You haven't closed the door. You've just stopped leaving it wide open for anyone to walk through without knocking. You don't need to return to who you were before the world asked too much of you. You don't need to explain your transformation to those who benefited from your silence. What you need is space to exist without constantly justifying your boundaries. Space to feel without being consumed. Space to be human without apology. And even as you stand there, more reserved, more guarded, more still than before, there's something important that hasn't changed. You're still here, not hardened into stone, not vanished into nothing, but present in your own way, watching, learning, choosing, carrying your experiences with quiet strength, holding your ground without raising your voice, remaining, not because it's easy, but because you've learned how to stay without losing yourself, how to be steady without being numb, how to survive without becoming empty, how to exist in a world that takes without letting it take everything, how to be still without disappearing, how to feel deeply without bleeding openly, how to move forward while honoring what shaped you, how to keep your heart intact, even when it's been tested again and again, how to stand in your truth without demanding validation, how to live with what happened without letting it harden you completely, how to remain present even when the instinct is to vanish, how to be here even after all the reasons you had to leave. You didn't move away because you were weak. You moved away because staying close required a version of you that was slowly disappearing. People often misunderstand distance. They see it as rejection, as indifference, as pride. But distance is often the language of someone who has learned the cost of being available without limits. You step back not to feel superior, but to feel stable. You discovered that strength doesn't always look like standing in the middle of everything. Sometimes it looks like knowing when to step out of the noise. You were taught, directly or indirectly, that being strong meant enduring, holding it together, carrying weight without complaint, showing up even when you were empty, and for a long time you did exactly that. You were reliable. You were present. You were the one people counted on. But no one noticed how much of yourself you were spending just to stay that way. No one asked how long you could keep giving without being replenished. Strength became an expectation placed on you, not a choice you made freely. So you learned a different kind of strength, a quieter one that doesn't announce itself or seek approval. You learned that walking away from what drains you is not weakness. You learned that saying no without explanation is not cruelty. You learned that protecting your inner space is not selfishness. I tease survival with dignity. You stopped arguing with people who needed you to be accessible at all times. You stopped proving that you cared by overextending yourself. You realized that real strength is not measured by how much you tolerate, but by how well you preserve yourself. There were moments when staying would have been easier on the outside, easier to explain, easier to be accepted, easier to avoid questions. But staying would have meant shrinking, and you were already tired of becoming smaller to fit into spaces that didn't honor you. Distance gave you clarity. It allowed you to hear your own thoughts again. It reminded you of who you were before you were constantly reacting to everyone else's needs. People noticed the change. They called you different. Some said you'd become cold. Some said you'd lost your warmth. What they didn't see was that you hadn't lost it, you had relocated it. You stopped giving it away freely, you kept it closer to your center. You reserved it for moments and people that felt real, reciprocal, grounded. That wasn't emotional withdrawal, that was emotional intelligence growing in real time. Strength often looks like distance because distance removes illusion. When you step back, you see patterns more clearly. You see who only shows up when they need something. You see who disappears when you stop chasing. You see which connections survive silence and which ones depend on constant effort from one side. That awareness can be uncomfortable, but it's honest. And honesty requires strength. Most people don't talk about you didn't stop caring about others, you stopped abandoning yourself for them. You stopped equating love with sacrifice. You saint opt confusing loyalty with endurance. You realized that being close to everything left you disconnected from yourself. Distance became the space where you could breathe again, where you could exist without performing strength for an audience that never asked how you were holding up. There's courage in choosing solitude over shallow connection. There's discipline in resisting the urge to explain yourself to people who have already decided who you are. There's maturity in accepting that not everyone will understand your boundaries, and that understanding is not a requirement for maintaining them. You grew into a strength that doesn't need to be loud, one that doesn't need to win arguments or prove points, one that simply stands firm. You became selective, not because you think you're better, but because you've learned the cost of being everywhere for everyone. You know what it takes to rebuild yourself after being drained. You know how long it takes to regain clarity once it's lost. So now you guard your energy the way someone guards something irreplaceable, because it is. That choice may look like distance, but it's rooted in self-respect. Strength doesn't always show up as persistence. Sometimes it shows up as restraint, as choosing not to respond, as leaving conversations unfinished, as allowing silence to speak for you. You don't need to correct every misunderstanding or defend every decision. You trust yourself enough to let your actions stand on their own. That trust didn't come easily. It was earned through exhaustion, disappointment, and reflection. You still show up, just differently. You show up with intention instead of obligation. You show up where you're present. CE is valued, not just expected. You show up without losing pieces of yourself in the process. And when you don't show up, it's not out of spite, it's out of awareness. Awareness that your well-being matters, that your limits are valid, that your strength deserves to be sustained, not exploited. Distance has given you perspective. It's shown you that some things fall apart not because you stepped away, but because they were only held together by your effort. And that realization, as painful as it can be, is freeing. It allows you to stop carrying what was never yours alone. It allows you to stand in your own space without guilt. You are not hiding. You are not retreating in fear. You are standing back with intention, watching, choosing, conserving, letting life meet you where you are instead of constantly meeting life on its terms. That kind of strength is invisible to those who equate noise with power, but it's unmistakable to those who understand what it takes to remain whole in a world that constantly asks you to give more than you have. Healing doesn't arrive with an announcement. It doesn't knock loudly or ask for attention. It moves quietly, often unnoticed, especially by the people who expect change to be dramatic. You didn't wake up one morning suddenly feeling better. There was no clear moment where everything made sense again. Healing began in the smallest decisions, the ones no one applauds. In choosing rest over explanation, in choosing silence over reaction, in choosing to pause instead of pushing yourself past another limit. For a long time, you thought healing meant fixing everything at once, becoming lighter overnight, letting go without resistance. But that idea only made you feel more broken when it didn't happen. Real healing didn't look like relief. It looked like confusion mixed with restraint. It looked like learning how to sit with discomfort without running from it. It looked like staying present even when your mind wanted to escape back into old patterns. You kept going through life while carrying things that hadn't been resolved. Conversations that ended without closure. Emotions that never found the right moment to be expressed. Expectations you placed on yourself that were never realistic to begin with. Healing wasn't about erasing those things. It was about learning how to live without letting them control every reaction. You stopped demanding instant peace from yourself. You allowed progress to be uneven. There were days when you thought nothing was changing. Days when weight felt just as heavy as before, but healing was happening in the background, in ways that didn't register immediately, in how you no longer chased answers from people who couldn't give them, in how you noticed your triggers sooner, in how you chose to step back instead of escalating. Those moments didn't feel like growth at the time. They felt like fatigue, but they were signs that something inside you was recalibrating. You learned that healing doesn't always feel gentle. Sometimes it feels like grief resurfacing. Sometimes it feels like anger finally finding its voice. Sometimes it feels like sadness you thought you were done with returning without warning. That didn't mean you were going backward. It meant you were finally strong enough to face what you had been avoiding just to survive. Suppressed emotions don't disappear. They wait. Healing gave them space to move without overwhelming you. You stopped forcing yourself to be okay for the comfort of others. You stopped minimizing what you felt just to keep the peace. That shift didn't come with confidence, it came with hesitation, with guilt, with moments of doubt where you wondered if you were becoming too distant, too sensitive, too difficult. But healing doesn't negotiate with old expectations. It asks you to be honest, even when honesty feels inconvenient. There were times when healing meant doing nothing at all, sitting still, letting days pass without improvement. allowing yourself to feel unproductive without self-punishment. You realized that rest wasn't laziness and slowing down wasn't failure. Your nervous system needed safety before it could rebuild strength. You gave yourself permission to stop performing recovery and start experiencing it. You began to notice how your reactions softened, not because you didn't care, but because you understood more. You didn't need to respond to everything immediately. You didn't need to defend every boundary. Silence stopped feeling like weakness and started feeling like choice. That shift wasn't visible to anyone else, but inside, it changed how you carried yourself through the world. Healing taught you patience with yourself. Not the kind that excuses stagnation, but the kind that respects timing. You stopped comparing your pace to others. You stopped measuring progress by how happy you looked. You understood that healing isn't about becoming someone new, it's about returning to yourself without the armor you were forced to wear. Some wounds didn't close neatly, some memories still lingered. Healing didn't remove them, it reduced their power. You could think about the past without being pulled back into it. You could remember without reliving. That distinction mattered. It meant you were no longer trapped inside what happened. You were standing outside it, aware, grounded, intact. You didn't announce your healing because you didn't need validation for it. You didn't explain it because it was personal, earned quietly through restraint and reflection. Healing didn't make you louder, it made you steadier. It didn't make you fearless, it made you more trusting of your ability to handle whatever surfaced. You learned that healing doesn't mean you stop hurting. It means hurt no longer dictates your choices. It means you can feel deeply without losing control. It means you can stay present even when emotions rise. That kind of balance doesn't draw attention. It doesn't impress people who expect visible transformation. But it changes everything about how you move, how you choose, how you stay grounded. Healing became less about arrival and more about awareness. Awareness of when to lean in and when to step back. Awareness of what drains you and what restores you. Awareness of your limits without shame. You stopped waiting for a moment where everything felt resolved. You accepted that healing is something you carry with you, not something you finish. And even now, healing continues in quiet ways, in the pauses you allow yourself, in the boundaries you keep without guilt, in the way you listen to your body instead of overriding it, in the way you trust that not everything needs to be fixed immediately, in the way you stay present with yourself without demanding perfection. You stayed, not loudly, not heroically, not in a way that demanded recognition. You stayed in the simplest way possible. You didn't disappear, even when disappearing would have felt easier. You didn't harden yourself into someone unreachable. You remained present quietly, steadily, in a world that taught you how tempting absence can be. Presence isn't about always being available. It isn't about answering every call or filling every silence. Presence is what remains after you stop trying to prove yourself. It's the decision to be here without performing, without over-explaining, without shrinking or expanding to meet expectations. You learn that being present doesn't require perfection. It requires honesty with where you are. There were moments when you weren't your best, moments when you were tired, distracted, uncertain. You showed up anyway, not with solutions, but with sincerity. You didn't try to fix everything or rescue anyone from their pain. You understood that sometimes the most meaningful thing you can offer is your attention, not advice, not reassurance, just your willingness to stay in the moment without turning away. You stopped measuring your worth by how much you could give. You stopped believing that being needed was the same as being valued. Presence taught you that real connection isn't built on constant effort. It's built on consistency, on showing up as yourself, even when yourself feels incomplete, even when you don't have the right words, even when silence is all you can offer. You noticed how people responded differently when you stopped trying so hard. Some drifted away, some leaned in. That taught you something important. The ones who stayed didn't need you to be perfect. They needed you to be real. They needed your steadiness more than your sacrifice. They needed to know you were there, not that you were exhausting yourself to prove it. Presence doesn't chase. It doesn't beg to be understood. It allows space without withdrawing completely. You learned how to sit with discomfort without escaping it, how to remain engaged without losing yourself. That balance didn't come naturally. It was built slowly, through mistakes, through moments where you overgave and paid for it, through moments where you pulled back too far and had to recalibrate. You realized that perfection creates distance. It intimidates, it performs, it hides vulnerability behind control. Presence does the opposite. It invites authenticity. It allows room for imperfection without shame. When you stopped trying to be everything, you became someone people could actually connect with. Someone human, someone grounded. There were times when staying present meant staying quiet, letting others feel what they need to feel without interrupting it. Trusting that your presence alone was enough. That kind of restraint takes strength. It goes against the urge to fix, to explain, to resolve. But you learn that some moments don't need to be solved. They need to be witnessed. You didn't disappear when things became uncomfortable. You didn't turn cold in the moments that mattered most. Even when you stepped back, you remained emotionally available in the ways that counted. You chose clarity over chaos. You chose honesty over performance. You chose to be here in a way that didn't cost you your peace. Presence taught you boundaries without walls. It taught you closeness without loss of self. You learned that you can care deeply without caring everything. You can stay connected without being consumed. That understanding changed how you move through relationships. You no longer cling or retreat. You stand where you are, open but grounded. You're still here, not because you had to be, but because you chose to be. Choice makes all the difference. It means your presence is an obligation, it's intention, and intention has weight. It creates trust. It allows connection to grow naturally instead of being forced. You don't need to promise forever. You don't need to guarantee outcomes. All you offer is now. Your attention, your honesty, your willingness to stay present even when things are uncertain. That is enough. More than enough. You remain not unchanged but intact. Not perfect, but real. Not loud, but steady. In a world that confuses presence with performance, you chose the quieter path. You chose to be here.